Okay, we're moving from augmented reality to reality as we start talking about sensors and the things they can measure and the stories that they can guide us to that we never had data for before. And with that is Amy Schmitz Weiss from San Diego State University. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here this morning. A big thank you to the Mobile Me and You conference organizers, volunteers, and staff to make this conference available. It's one of my favorite conferences to come to. So really happy and glad that I could be here and have this opportunity to talk with you today. So just by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with sensors? Okay, a few of you. Great. So in some cases, some of this information will be very relevant in terms of what I'm going to be talking about. And how many of you are familiar with spatial technology? Raise of hands. Okay, it's usually a little bit fewer numbers when we looked at that concept. Okay, well today what I want to do is talk with you specifically about the idea of looking at local news through the lens of sensors and spatial technology in particular, and the ways in which we can look at this as another layer in the storytelling process in particular. As mentioned this morning with the presentations, as well as from yesterday, there's so many different approaches that we can use now with mobile technology, AR and VR, that provides another experience to how one experiences a story that I think gets to another level of what we can think about in terms of spatiality with news. This is an area of my research that I've been spending time on for the past several years in terms of looking at how much we can understand space and place with location in a different way with storytelling. And I think one particular pathway that we can see some developments happening is in this space with sensors and spatial technology in particular. So just to put it out there in terms of having the general foundation, what is a sensor? It basically detects and responds to some type of input from the physical environment. This input could be light, it could be heat, it could be motion, moisture, pressure, anything thereof. And what happens is the input that comes into the sensor comes back out, usually in electronic form, but they are analog sensors that have been around for a long time, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But from the electronic standpoint, get transmitted into data points that can then further be analyzed. This image here is an actual PM2.5 sensor that measures particulate matter in the air for air pollution. In particular, this was one sensor that I had used in a project a few years back in looking at air quality in San Diego. And when we think about sensors in particular, the history behind it, like I said, has been around for a long time. In terms of analog, going outside of electronic, we can go all the way back to the nilometer that looked at gauging water levels with flooding back in the day, all the way to the magnetic compass, to gauging wind speed and humidity. Telescopes and microscopes, sensors have been a big part of our life. And now we see them in another development in terms of electronic form. So sensors today cut across three different areas. You have the do-it-yourself model. How many of you have done a do-it-yourself sensor model? Okay. It's a fun part of making a sensor is the do-it-yourself model, which is a part of an image here. There's out-of-the-box sensors. Have any of you used out-of-the-box sensors? Okay, great, a few. And then if you may not be aware, there's actually sensors directly in your smartphone. And the capability of what smartphones can now capture, whether it's Android or iOS, is becoming more sophisticated in terms of the sensors that are in these devices, in particular, that can capture a variety of different pieces of information. Within the past 5 years, sensors have actually advanced quite a bit in terms of their cost effectiveness. Many of them have come down in cost and price. Their ability to capture more detail and be a lot more accurate than they were even 5 years ago has changed the overall industry. And then on top of it as well, the size of the sensors have become much smaller from what they used to be as well. And so with this, there is this opportunity that has been captured in the news industry, of course, over the past decade or so, or even less, in terms of looking at sensors with journalism. So of course, when we look at this, there's the opportunity to use sensors from a variety of different organizations, companies, do-it-yourself, the mobile phone, as well as from out of the box that can help with news gathering and reporting process to help in telling important stories in the community. And again, this data can include water, air, temperature, wind, and soil. There's a variety of different kinds that are out there. What I thought I would do is to kind of bring us more up to speed of where we are now, is kind of take you back through a bit of a journey of what some of the exemplars have been in sensor journalism over the years and where we are now. So USA Today, is Gary still here? So USA Today did this back in 2012, in which they looked at specific areas across the country, about 13 states, 800 sites, where they looked at the contaminants in the soil from metal factories that had actually been defunct, and looking at measuring the lead and the metal in the soil. At the time, they actually ended up using X-ray gun sensors to help explore this matter throughout the country in 2012. If any of you are familiar with Cicada Tracker from WNYC and Radiolab, that was done several years back to kind of predict the arrival of the cicadas on the northeast coast in particular. And with this one, it was a big community effort to help get people a part of this project and having them deploy sensors in their backyards to help with this. They were able to gather about 1,700 temperature readings from over 800 locations in the community, which was quite an accomplishment at the time in terms of trying to be able to capture this kind of information to help predict when the cicadas were going to arrive on the coast. We go over to 2016, advancing through time, the Harlem Heat Project. Have any of you ever heard of the Harlem Heat Project? This one was done by WNYC, in which they used heat sensors to actually examine the health concerns in Harlem apartments in the summer. And they actually deployed 60 sensors in the community to look at exactly how hot were the apartments getting because of not having the lack of proper air conditioning, and the health concerns that would be posed to those that are sensitive populations, the elderly, children, and so forth. And so this was quite a successful story that they were able to develop into several series of stories as part of the investigation. We move internationally. And this was done by a news organization out of Germany, a little bit of a fun topic of looking at bees and actually having sensors within beehives, as well as cameras on the beehives to see the action of what happens with a beehive and queen bees, knowing that the state of the bee population is at risk globally as well, and developing a story around that in terms of tracking the bees, the sensors. The same news organization also did this on cows. So they actually named the 3 cows. As you see here, there were 3 different cows from 3 different farms, an organic farm, a small farm, and a bigger farm. And what they did is they actually tracked what these cows were doing on the farm. So they had sensors around the area in which they were moving and doing their feeding and their daily cow activities. But they also put sensors inside one of the stomachs of cows, because cows have multiple stomachs. And they actually were able to track more of the bioinformation on the cows, their pH levels, body temperature, and so forth, to kind of talk about the differences between these different kinds of cows on these different farms by using sensors and putting a face and personality to each of the cows for this particular news investigation. Just recently, and I want to bring us up to speed now, it was just within the past couple of years, this was actually done last year in 2018. Molly Peterson and KQED up in LA area looked at heat-related health hazards in the workplace and how, due to climate change, the increasing hot temperatures that are being faced across the country, but also in California, and how this can impact workers that have jobs indoors where there may not be proper ventilation. And in her research And her work that she did, she deployed temperature and humidity sensors to 16 workers in 7 workplaces. So this included car washes, laundry mats, dry cleaners, and so forth. And found that many of them were putting themselves into these hazardous situations where they were working in very hot workplaces and still continuing to work. They would get sick and then come right back and finish their work. As a result of the reporting, as of earlier this year in February, there was potentially looking at the policy changing within OSHA of having proper ventilation systems and making changes to protect workers from having these kind of health hazards in the workplace due to increasing heat temperatures in the summertime in particular. This was just actually done just this past year. Bitter Cold, that was done by the Capitol News Service at the University of Maryland, where they wanted to, again, look at the impact of climate change within the Baltimore area and how much frigid temperatures were having an impact on Baltimore residents in their home, where they may not have the proper heating ability in their homes, and how cold it could get into their actual apartments and homes at that time. They actually deployed temperature sensors to capture these cold temps. They actually had the community come together to help build those sensors and then deploy them. They followed this up just this summer with Code Red, which actually just recently received an Online News Association award in September. They also were an ONA grantee for the past year for this particular project. It was a collaboration with the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, along with Capitol News Service and NPR. And again, they ended up putting out temperature and humidity sensors in several homes to identify how hot one's home could get during the summertime without proper air conditioning and ventilation. They were also influenced by the Harlem Heat Project from a few years ago in terms of building out this project as well. And then just recently this summer, the Financial Times wanted to look at air quality globally. So what they did is, instead of building their own sensors, they ended up buying an out-of-the-box solution called Flow, which was $179, as you see here. And they wanted to measure air quality in specific cities: Beijing, Lagos, London, New York, and Sao Paulo. So they gave it to their correspondents in each of these cities and had them track their daily activities with this pollution monitor for a couple of weeks, and had them actually give a video diary of what they were experiencing and give an account of what they noticed, and keeping track of the data. Not a surprise, they actually found very high levels of pollution, air pollution in their areas, even though there have been some changes in some of these cities in terms of air quality. They were still surprised to notice that the numbers were quite high, depending on where they were going, whether it was indoors or outdoors, and what activities they were engaging in particular. So what do, of course, all these projects have in common, right, when we look at this over the past years? Well, of course, one, you have the news gathering and reporting of the particular environmental issue. Right? You can look at this from the standpoint of temperature, climate change, air quality, even water quality in some cases, where some news organizations have delved into that. And then using sensors to collect this information and then analyze it, and then bringing in community partners and stakeholders into this process, depending on what level of collaboration and community partnership is involved. Of course, tying this back into the news publication that ends up coming out with the narrative, the multimedia that comes along with it, as well as any infographics that can help detail the data to this particular kind of project. But with that, what is missing? There's another layer here that we can potentially utilize that might be able to provide another dynamic of information in the process. And that is looking at spatial information technology. This really is the next frontier in sensors and sensing. There's a lot underway in terms of what's being done in this space across the globe in terms of companies that are focusing specifically on this effort. You have remote sensing that's, of course, coming in from satellites and drones. You have GPS systems, as well as GIS and mapping applications that are also contributing to this. And ultimately, with this kind of spatial information technology, it provides another layer of information by which one can analyze spatially what's happening in a given area, and what might be potentially happening with specific environmental issues we may see happening in our communities in particular. So one example of this to tell you about is Aclima. They're actually in San Diego and did this mobile sensing project just this spring into the summer in San Diego, where they had outfitted specific cars across the city and captured air quality data across several different neighborhoods. They ended up going 32,000 miles, around 96 days of capturing air quality data in those neighborhoods. Now, oftentimes when we think about sensors, they tend to be static sensors that collect information in one place and moment in time. But the idea of being able to use mobile sensing is another layer, just like with the Financial Times example of having the personal pollution monitor along with the reporter. This is another demonstration of that, having that ability to capture the data in dynamic moments as one is moving around, which is more representative of what's happening in one's day-to-day life of going through a specific environment. We're not static creatures that only stay in one particular place and moment in time. And so this is an interesting example of looking at, again, the aspects of how much this mobile sensing can provide another layer to what might be happening in the environment around us dynamically and within a particular moment in time. There is also LiDAR. Have any of you heard of LiDAR? Okay, a few of you. LiDAR was actually recently featured in the news with a recent discovery that was mentioned in the news recently. It's basically light detection and ranging. And this basically takes in the energy that is reflected from the Earth from satellites. So as you can see here, it gives back different aspects of a heat map, for instance, is one visualization. But it allows for one to see exactly at a deeper level from above ground, of course, from the satellites, what might be happening in a particular area. NOAA has been doing a lot of work in this area. There's a lot of different data sets that they have been publishing up on their website of looking at coastal changes, ocean temperature, erosion, wetland management, for instance, using this technique of remote sensing. And it's only going to be a matter of time before we see more organizations moving in this direction of using remote sensing as well to help explore specific parts of the particular areas and communities around us. So when we look at this in the process of, as I was mentioning before, the ability to provide a deeper dive into what might be happening in a particular community when we look at a specific environmental issue, the spatial information technology can provide another particular layer in this process. Specifically through remote and mobile sensing, it can provide another deep dive into exactly what might be happening in a specific community, looking at those different elements in particular. But then if we further explore this from the standpoint of where one is in relation to the moment, the space and place where they are, the spatiality of where one is in relation to that particular environmental issue, it creates a whole nother layer of thinking about the importance of local news and what's proximate to a user, to a news citizen. And so this dovetails into this specific aspect of looking at spatial journalism, which is a concept I've been developing over the past several years that looks at the idea of how much location, when broken down physically, augmented, and virtually, can provide another layer to looking at how storytelling can be done. And through that lens, specifically looking at how information that could potentially be geolocated, geotagged, proximate to where the user is, where that environmental issue is happening, down to the granular level of where that sensor data has been collected, can provide a really impactful narrative for the news citizen to have deeper information about what's happening around them, whether it's related to the climate, the temperature changes, their water quality, the soil that they plant their seeds in, to where the air that they breathe in particular. So when we look at this additional layer, it really provides another aspect to helping the news citizen be connected at even a deeper level of their local community, and for the local news to provide that granularity. I know someone yesterday was talking about granularity from the Tribune and how important that granularity is. And it's more important than ever at the local news level in terms of this kind of information. And this is actually wanted. A few years ago, I did an air quality project with open source air quality sensors with my students and iNewsSource, which is a nonprofit investigative news organization in San Diego. It was funded through an Online News Association grant. And as part of that project, the students were able to provide air quality data, specific neighborhoods where these sensors were deployed. And then produce news stories based off of it that led to this bigger investigation. At the end of the project, we ended up surveying the readers of iNewsSource to ask them about this experience. And the sensor data did make an impact. It did have an importance for them. 84% of them said it helped to explain the air quality in their area than they had otherwise information and knowledge of. 88% of them were actually already local environmental news users. And it probably should be no surprise to us that environment, climate change, what's going on in the world around us is at the top of where a lot of news citizens' mindset is right now. And what drives them to consume specific kinds of topics in their own community. And this will only increase in the years to come. Also, how much this allowed for them to have the idea that this is something that they want more of. 94% of them said that they were very interested in getting more of these kinds of stories about their neighborhoods in their community. And as part of this, we also were able to map the air sensor data to these specific neighborhoods. And by, again, having them navigate through those particular maps and visualizations, it allowed for them to have a better understanding and learning of the topic. Again, we tend to be visual learners in many cases, and being able to visualize that in the exact location proximate to where we are creates another layer to being able to understand important issues, particularly as it relates to air quality. So all that to say is that this granularity does matter, and that the news citizen is wanting this kind of level of information. When we dive deeper into the aspect of proximate to where they are, it also matters. As I mentioned, I've been doing this research and looking at spatial journalism over the past few years. I've done multiple surveys, random sample surveys across the country of news consumers and what they prefer in terms of a news experience with their mobile device. And in particular, this one was a study that came out just last year. That was about over 900 US adults, random sample that looked at what kind of geolocated news experience they wanted and their preferences by which they wanted this. And in particular, it was broken down into specific location identifiers by distance, by looking at geographic coordinates, exact address, neighborhood, context, and time. And of those, most of the respondents identified the most with distance, neighborhood, and time in terms of getting this kind of information. Again, when we overlay this with environmental issues and concerns, this provides another layer of thinking about how close one is to that particular environmental issue or concern that might be happening in their community, and how much they want to have that information on hand. Within this, and this is probably going to look like a lot of garble, but an analysis of looking at what people were preferring by location identifiers and breaking it down by specific subject, again, it did show the same pattern that folks want this kind of geolocated news that's proximate to where they are in that moment in time for local weather and traffic, for local entertainment and events, for local crime, local government, and politics. Oftentimes people say, well, local weather and traffic, nah, that's a no-brainer. Of course people want to know what the weather's going to be like and how they get from point A to point B. But as we understand what's happening more in society right now with our climate and the environmental issues therein, local weather and traffic is much more than just what is the temperature today. People are definitely motivated more to know, why is it cold today? Why was it hot yesterday? Why is there red algae in my local waterway? right? So again, thinking about exactly how far this particular issue is away from them, a few miles away, to how near, 5 minutes, or even at the neighborhood level. This granularity makes a difference in terms of them being informed and knowing exactly what's happening in particular. So just to wrap up, and then I was going to share some resources with you because I don't want to keep you from lunch. Environmental issues are only going to continue to increase importance globally, of course, but locally. Local investigation is going to be crucial for the news industry, and sensors can play a major role in this effort. Sensor technology has advanced tremendously, even in the past 5 years. From when I did the project with my students. As I mentioned, it's become smaller, it's more affordable. There's a lot more players in the market. There have gone into mobile to do-it-yourself versions. The accuracy and calibration that is now in play with most of these sensors has advanced quite a bit since 5 years ago as well. For the journalism educators and students here, being adept in spatial and sensor technology is going to be important for the future of storytelling. As it was mentioned this morning with Yusuf, as well as with Gary, in terms of looking at augmented reality, there is so much more potential that can be gained from looking at spatial audio experiences, spatial storytelling experiences that allow for them to delve deep into specific environmental concerns in their local community. And then lastly, like I said, this granularity really does matter to local news. People do want this level of information and detail, and sensors and spatial technology can be one pathway by which to do this. So a couple of resources to leave you with. I also put out a link to this presentation on Twitter, so you can find it up there. But a couple of places, if you're interested in getting your hands dirty with making a sensor, which can be quite fun, there's plug-and-play options as well as soldering ones if you're into soldering. Adafruit, Arduino, and Seed Studio are just a few. If anyone is familiar with John Keefe, he has been a sensor guru in the industry. He has several how-tos on his website, as well as on his Git page of how one can build out a lot of the sensors. For the Code Red project in particular, they built out their specific heat sensors as a result of John Keefe's instructions how to build a heat sensor. Just recently, this past couple months, I implemented a curriculum guide for bringing together journalism and science educators that actually features a science journalism module. So for educators in the audience, you may find that of help. And then to show you a couple of the how-tos behind the scenes for some sensor projects, the one that we did at San Diego State is up here, the Code Red project, where they go into the how-to of how they built out their heat sensors. Lehigh Sensor Journalism project as well, which looked at particular temperature fluctuations indoors, and then an air quality project that was done at the University of Utah as well. So I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you for your time.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I work at a newspaper, so for editors who might say, oh, great, you've got a sensor, go out and get some data. You got a 4 o'clock deadline. How much time and effort does it take to get data so it's statistically significant and meaningful?
Yeah, it wouldn't happen overnight, so that would be a disappointment for your editor. I mean, I think with something like this, it does take time. For instance, the project that I did with our students and with iNewsSource, that was a year-long project. We actually spent the first 6 months doing R&D and testing out multiple manufacturers and their sensors to get it to the right sensor kit, and then deploying them and doing some test runs, and then calibrating them against other sensors that were industry standard, before launching it the following 6 months. So if one does embark on this, I would say give yourself ample time. It's not something that could be done just overnight. You can go through the motions of seeing exactly how the sensor works, what it's collecting, what it's not, to kind of get a sense. But I would say in terms of doing something that's comprehensive and robust, you want to give yourself sufficient time. With the Code Red and Bitter Cold, they spent about 1.5 years on both of those to get those ramped up. And they learned some lessons from the Bitter Cold before they jumped into doing Code Red, because the one came before the other. I think with each sensor project, you learn from the next, so it's kind of trial by testing things out. in terms of the timing that it takes. But I would say give yourself sufficient amount of time to kind of explore different sensor options, because for the fact that there's so many more on the market now, to try the ones that you feel will work best for what you're trying to measure, and testing out quite a few of them, whether it's out of the box to a do-it-yourself model to even if it's a smartphone in that regard too.
So some of mine were kind of answered then. But I'm curious, did most of your students who did this, were they journalists and then they did the scientific part and then came back and wrote the stories and the video and did all of that? Or did you guys get data and then give it to journalists? Or how did that come about?
The students did the stories. And so we ended up working with iNewsSource, and so they were our collaborator. And they actually went through and identified the stories that would make it to the website. So not all the stories that the students did made it to the website, but the majority of them did. They actually did the collection of the data. So they deployed their sensor, and they actually gave them names, which was really cute. And so they deployed their sensors in specific neighborhoods, and they would have a rigor schedule in terms of the time of day and being consistent from week to week of going to that particular location to gather that particular data for a specific amount of time and keeping track of it. The way the sensor worked, it would allow for us to capture the data, put it on micro SD, and then load it back onto a website to later then analyze, go through, visualize it onto a map, but then also calibrating that information against industry standard air quality sensors with our Graduate School of Public Health at our university as well, which was a crucial partner to this too. So having collaboration, community partners is important, and working with folks from public health can be a really helpful aspect to embarking on this kind of project.
So did the journal, I guess I'm trying to figure out, did the journalists, were they also in science? Because I can't imagine as a journalist just doing all that. That's like going over my head.
Yeah, we spent a substantial amount of time getting the students ramped up in terms of understanding air quality. I co-taught the class with a colleague from the College of Sciences over the course of 6 months. And so they took a deep dive into understanding what is air quality, air pollution, and all the nuances therein. And then they actually made information explainer videos to help the community understand and break it down so that for them to be able to understand it as well. So it was a big learning process for them in terms of building out the sensors, to learning the science behind it, to embarking in the community. And we also brought in community partners to deploy sensors in their own backyards too, and collect that data as part of the project too. So.
I was intrigued by your use of the term news citizen. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, I think oftentimes we think about the idea of who receives the news as the audience or the public, but I think in many cases those terms can be somewhat limiting, and in some cases fit to different models of the industry. And I think when we think about the future of where are people going to pay attention to specific local news, being a part of the news, being engaged with the news, I think gets at the level of making them news citizens instead of treating them as an audience or a public in that regard.
I can see how things like climate change and how it really impacts your local neighborhood can really be something that people would relate to.
Mm-hmm. In so many ways, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So I had a question too. So I was interested what the response you got back from the scientific community and other key players that way. If they, trusted in your experiment and the way it went out, or if they had pushback. We've had some pushback in our sensor projects just from people saying, well, these results could have been sabotaged, or people are biasing it one way or the other. So I just wondered if you had any of that.
Yeah, dual part to your answer. One, I think, one aspect of this is we saw it as an opportunity to do education. So a big part of this is we had a lot of explainers and primers to help people understand what we did, why we did it, what our methodology was. So no one could poke holes in it and say, okay, well, why didn't you do this or that? It was clearly there for them to see. The systematic and rigorous process that we went through in terms of our R&D that led to the actual sensors we deployed, and then the calibration that we did working along with the College of Public Health really helped in terms of building our credibility and trust with the community. Our College of Public Health, Graduate School of Public Health in our city is very well respected in terms of the work that they've been doing and looking at air quality and their community outreach that they've had. So I think that was a big factor to helping people to put trust and credibility in what we were doing and to be transparent, to show our work. As Brian Boyer always used to say, show your work. I don't know if he still says that. Okay. So, and he was actually a part of the project too at one point, really helpful. So that's one layer. I think the other side of it too is recognizing that people are going to have questions about the way in which this technology is used. We did get some pushback from the EPA in terms of this approach. We did reach out to them multiple times to get them to be a part of this, and they pushed back. And so we recognized that that was something that we were going to have to deal with. But they also recognized that this is another area that they're now diving into in terms of deploying more kinds of mobile sensing and do-it-yourself models that they're slowly implementing in different cities across the country. So that was another factor that we had to contend with as well. But I think that happens with a lot of stories. You're going to have people that are going to try and poke holes and try and discredit the process. But I think the more transparent, the more you can explain exactly what you did and how you did it. We were clear to say that this is not representative of everything. These were the specific neighborhoods we looked at for this specific time. So we can't say that this is what it's always going to be. Things change in specific neighborhoods. The temperature, climate, wind speed changes. But for a snapshot in time, this is what we were able to provide to the community. So I think being clear on those points can help in terms of meeting some of those hurdles and challenges.
Two questions, really. First of all, I've been a part of 2 sensor projects on air quality and water quality. If someone was to do this for the first time, based on what you know of the different types of sensors, soil, water, whatever, which would be the easiest to start with for students or for someone just beginning?
Depends on what your resources are. So if you have the opportunity to get some money to purchase a couple of do-it-yourself sensors, I would say go that route because you learn a ton in terms of how the specific data is collected and in what ways. However, on the other end, you could go the route of doing like the airflow, like the Financial Times did, and doing a quick, short diary of one's experience with the particular sensor. In that case, it was $170 some. But some of them range up to $1,000 per sensor kit, which is quite expensive. So I think it depends on kind of the resources that you have in order to embark and start on it. Some of the ones that have been able to go with very little ramping up, what I would say would be temperature and humidity. The cost for those sensors is super cheap in comparison to the air quality sensors, which are going to run you around $40 upwards to $80, depending on the kind of sensor it is, if you're doing it yourself in particular.
Okay, thank you. Also, since I don't read German, which cow was happiest?
I believe it was the organic farmer.
That's
in terms of.
Thank
you. Yeah.
This is a sort of a comment both for Amy. It seems to me that, and I want to get your ideas about this, that using sensors is a way to gather information that could rather easily be displayed with augmented or virtual reality. Is that correct? And because I'm thinking the combination of each of your 2 comments and talks really create some wonderful projects. Yes, no?
You pretty much asked my question. Well, no. The reason why is it was a fantastic presentation, and I love the term spatial journalism. And what excites me most is the opportunity to visualize these data points in 3D. And what I'm curious to learn is, and perhaps we could have a conversation later, But have you had any experiments or case studies on translating these spreadsheets of these numbers into a space that allows a deeper understanding, or at least a different perspective within 3D?
Yeah, I had to change it on my slide to show you again I don't know if they can load it back up, the projector. But for the remote sensing aspect, I think there's so many layers that can be potentially looked at when you think about the AR experience and being able to load, for instance, the specific dynamics of the data that's being collected. I mean, for thinking about the Lawndale example and the garbage that was being dumped, I can't imagine the amount of chemicals that have probably seeped into the soil. Probably be a need for doing another round of the ghost factories in Lawndale, but looking at the potential data that could be garnered from that particular community in terms of the air quality, but also what might be in the soil as a result of that garbage being loaded up in the Lawndale community, and being able to layer that in particular neighborhoods. I think there's so much more potential in being able to allow for people to see that directly in front of them while they're standing in front of their own home. I think provides a whole nother layer to thinking about storytelling and impact in local news. To date, I haven't seen anyone jump in and yet do it, but maybe you guys might have the opportunity to pioneer that. But I think we are getting to that point in the future where that will be likely. And I think people are expecting it, just based on the research that I've been doing in terms of what news consumers, news citizens are wanting. That kind of level of granularity, I think, is becoming more sought after.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just a comment. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You go first.
I was giving you the microphone.
Oh, you were giving me the mic. Okay. Sorry about that. No, I just want to make another comment that sort of builds on that, and I think might tie in with the drone presentation we're going to get. I think as you see climate change, somehow combining photographs, if you can get historic photographs, and I think this is the hard part. What did a landscape look like before? I think about this because I've been riding bikes around mid-Missouri a lot, and over the summer I thought, last year that was a field of soybeans, and now I see fish jumping out of it because we've had so much flooding. But I wondered if there's a way to combine sensor readings, and again, I think combining scientific data with mapping and visualization, you can actually show people what climate change means.
Exactly. I think that's a great example of being able to delve deep into showing those aspects in a particular community by being able to layer that historical information on top of present, on top of the sensor data that's being collected over, granted, a period of time that allows one to really see exactly what's happening around them in particular, and having all of those layers.
Thanks. Sorry, I've got one more question. Smartphones.
Yes.
Is there a way to use all the sensors that are on here, create some sort of app or program to have an array of these, I don't know, 1,000, 100,000, just, you've got these things, they travel, they go to different places, you geotag, you can sense different things and send data back. Is there, are you doing work along those lines, or is that kind of the next frontier?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple different ways in which that's being done right now. There's a little bit more flexibility when you look at the Android operating environment to being able to deploy sensors onto the device and be able to track that information and connect it with their location than the iOS. There's still limitations in terms of what iOS offers and what Android offers in particular. But there are specific applications that have started to come into the market by specific organizations and companies that create a mobile app that actually collects the information from your phone and then maps it to a specific website so one can see exactly what's happening in that particular area. For instance, with the curriculum guide that I launched with my colleague, we actually looked at Google Science Journal, which is a tool that's being used in a lot of high schools and elementary schools right now. And within the Google Science Journal, there's a lot of different sensors and tutorials on how students can learn about the basics of physics and so forth with specific sensors that are already in the phone. And so there's potential in terms of looking at those aspects within the Google Science Journal in terms of breaking that down into some specific basics of motion, light, for instance, in that regard. To date, there hasn't yet been an air quality sensor that can directly connect into the iOS. However, there are other companies that are working on that for the Android right now, where it would be a plug-in on top of the phone. So there's yet to be in terms of that regard, but there's a lot of workarounds and variations on it.
The slide you have up is pertinent here because you're looking at government sensors, and so the comparing to past historical data, that might be the most reliable source. Are there certain agencies, areas where they do it well or not so well? Like, have you had luck with public records requests to get some of that stuff? Like, how talk to us about accessing more historical sensor data through folks like the government?
Yeah, excellent question. So when we did our project with the air quality, in the process of doing this, we identified that there were specific stations, air quality stations set by the EPA in San Diego. However, in the process of discovering that, there's historical data that goes back in time, even to the last week, for instance, in terms of capturing the air quality in the community. However, those stations were created and built over 50, 60 years ago. Communities and cities change, people move. So the stations that were created originally, in some cases, they're not as populated, and other areas have now become more populated. And so we recognize that there was a definite gap in terms of the actual number of stations in San Diego proper to be able to capture air quality, and nothing on the border for San Ysidro. My colleague in the Graduate School of Public Health has been doing a lot of work in this area in which she was able to get an air quality sensor on top of the San Ysidro border station to capture data over a given period of time, along with the EPA, and they actually implemented it for a temporary period of time because they're looking at the possibility of potentially putting in an official station there at the border, but there hasn't been one, which kind of, again, gets back to the aspects of looking at this historical government data can provide some insight, but doesn't necessarily represent the current reality of what's happening in communities. And so for our project in particular, we felt that it was even more important to provide insight as to what was happening in these specific neighborhoods where the air quality station wasn't anywhere near many of these neighborhoods. So they actually didn't have any kind of representative form of data to tell them exactly what the air quality was in that particular area, because the air station was 50 miles away, 20 miles away, to be able to really capture what's happening in that hyper-local environment, for instance. So I think there's a lot of potential to be able to do comparisons between what exactly is the government data showing and what can be actually captured in current time with the community in that particular neighborhood.
That strikes me as interesting in your concept of spatial reasoning. Then you overlaid another data set of, in this case, population, to then the story in and of itself is the fact that the sensors were not in the right places. The journalist in me says, there's the story, not even what the sensors say. So that's fascinating.
Exactly. And the idea of the air quality too, right? The stations capture air quality at a specific height that is different from the regular human height that we're at. So as part of this, we also had to debate exactly where would we place these sensors, at what level, in terms of what people breathe, because it's different than the atmosphere, and how much that could differ in terms of the kind of air quality data we were getting in that particular case. Because many of these EPA stations get it at the atmospheric, the higher levels, that may not necessarily be getting it to the granular level of where one is sitting or standing, in particular in a park. So we made sure that as the students were deploying these specific sensors, that they kept it at waist level or higher. So if they were on a park bench, it sat right next to them on the park bench. Or if they were at a cafe, it sat on the table in the cafe in particular. So that way it was at the same breathing level as one would breathe normal air. So I think some of these are nuances that can be challenged in terms of jumping into looking at these kinds of investigations in specific communities. And I think it leads to more questions as Gary was mentioning, embarking on this, I think, doesn't provide a finite answer to say this is what it is, right? I think it provides more questions for the community to say, okay, exactly what do we do now? How do we move forward? So I think it gets to one layer of that aspect of bringing the community closer to that particular environmental issue versus saying, okay, well, it is what it is, this is the data. But really saying, okay, well, what are the other nuances that are happening here that drives us to ask those additional questions, to continue that conversation and to move it forward.
Sorry, I know we probably want to wrap up soon, and I want to keep everybody from lunch, like you were saying too. You mentioned all this great climate data. I know, particularly with our products, people rely on us to tell them the weather, but how do we bridge that gap to get them to understand more about the climate and kind of figure out a way to distribute that in the way that we do strongly, like look from a hyper-local perspective in terms of what your weather is?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it gets back to the standpoint of what I was mentioning, how proximate they are to those spaces and places that matter to them. So in the research that I've done, it has shown that the news citizen, news consumer wants to know exactly what's happening near them where they live, work, and play. So if you can identify ways in which, the changing of the, perhaps the sea level rise, potentially if they work near a body of water, but they may not live there, it's going to impact some aspect of their life or their children's life in the future, depending on where they live. Or if they live in an area where there is a waterway and there's dams, for instance, right? So breaking it down in terms of looking at those aspects, or the water quality that's directly in their backyard. So I think breaking it down into those smaller pieces of what's happening exactly around them, where they live, work, and play, makes a difference in terms of them being more connected. I think someone was mentioning on Pointer just a few months back how popular the weather blog for the Washington Post has become. Because they don't just talk about the weather, they talk about things that are impacted by the weather. Right? Weather changes every day, but there's all these other layers to what's happening around us that have an impact on what we do. So I think connecting that granular level in terms of what's happening around them makes a difference in terms of getting them to connect to that environmental issue more.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
And delightfully, we had a bunch of questions. We've run a little over, so if people don't mind, and Robert in particular, if you don't mind, we'll start your session at 1 o'clock rather than 12:30, and that will give us also an extra 15 minutes for lunch. So we'll have 45 minutes for lunch. We'll start Robert's session at 1 o'clock. Okay, see you then. Thank you.